Let's dive into something. It's pretty relevant these days. We're talking carbon offsetting.
Yeah.
You hear about it everywhere.
Everywhere.
Companies going green. You book a flight. Hey, you want to offset this?
Yeah.
But is it really all it's cracked up to be? How does it work?
Yeah.
Well, we took a deep dive into an episode of Masood Khan's Sustainability Rewired.
Okay.
And we're going to break it all down for you.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic because, I mean, we're facing this huge urgent need to reduce emissions.
Right.
But, some things are just really hard to change overnight, and that's kind of where this whole idea of carbon offsetting comes in.
So paint a picture for me, for our listeners. What are we talking about when we say carbon offsetting?
Okay, so imagine like a seesaw, right? On one side, you've got your own carbon footprint. The emissions you're personally responsible for. Mm-hmm. On the other side, you've got actions that actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. So offsetting is like adding weight to that side. You're trying to balance things out.
Okay. So I like that visual, that seesaw analogy. We're trying to compensate for what we can't eliminate quite yet. One thing that came up on Sustainability Rewired was this idea of a cap-and-trade system.
Right.
I think the quote was, emissions trading incentivizes companies to reduce their carbon output.
Yeah.
So what's going on with that?
So basically, you set a limit that's the cap on the total emissions allowed. And companies, they get these allowances to pollute up to a certain point. But the interesting thing is, if they manage to emit less than their allowance, they can then sell their leftover allowances to companies that are struggling to stay under.
So it becomes like a financial game then, where it's like pollute more, you pay more.
Yeah.
But if you can pollute less, you can actually profit, potentially.
Exactly. It's a way to make, going green make business sense. And there are some real-world examples. The European Union emissions trading system, that's actually led to a significant drop in emissions from power plants.
Interesting. So it's like it's working in some ways?
It seems to be, yes.
Having an effect? But what about individuals? Because that's where you get into these voluntary carbon offsets that you always hear about, right?
Exactly.
Like I'm booking a flight. Hey, you want to, donate a couple bucks to plant some trees?
Yeah, and they talked about that on the podcast as like investing in offset projects.
Okay.
Which is a good way to think about it. Let's say you're taking a flight to, I don't know, Paris.
Mm-hmm.
And, right now, a pretty unavoidable source of emissions.
Right.
But by investing in a project that, let's say, plants trees in the Amazon rainforest, you're helping to soak up that carbon dioxide, so you're kind of balancing out the impact.
That makes sense. But how do we know that these projects are legit?
Right.
Because couldn't anyone just kind of slap a carbon offset label on something?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where these carbon credit standards come in. They were talking about the importance of verified credits on the podcast. And these standards, like the gold standard or they're like independent auditors for these offset projects. So they really dig deep and make sure that it's actually reducing emissions and it's not just greenwashing. And they look at things like, additionality.
Okay.
So, are these emission reductions that would have happened anyway?
Right.
Or is this something new? And also permanence. How do we make sure that that carbon is going to stay locked up for the long term?
So there's some checks and balances in place.
Exactly.
Okay. So this is all really interesting. But why should our listeners care about this?
Well, because it's becoming, more and more important for everyone to understand, not just like policymakers or huge corporations. Like, this affects everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's an example of how, this could directly impact a listener?
Okay, so let's say you're looking at a company's sustainability report. Right? They're making all these claims about being carbon neutral. Well, how do you know if they're legit?
Right.
Are they actually investing in these high-quality, verified offsets?
Right.
Or is it just a PR move? So knowing this stuff helps you cut through the noise and make more informed decisions as a consumer, as a citizen.
It's like being a savvy consumer, but for the planet, in a way.
Exactly.
Sustainability Rewired also talked about these growing carbon markets.
Yeah.
What's the deal with that?
So this is really interesting because it's an area that's changing quickly. It used to be that this was like the domain of big corporations, right? But now it's opening up and we're seeing more and more opportunities for individuals to participate.
Okay.
So that might be directly offsetting their own personal travel or maybe even investing in carbon reduction projects. It's becoming, a whole new sector with a lot of potential for innovation and impact.
So we've really gone from like the ABCs of carbon offsetting to its growing role in the market. This has been a true deep dive, I would say.
And, we've only just scratched the surface.
Right.
It'll be really interesting to see how this all unfolds. How might carbon offsetting influence your industry or your investments or even just your everyday decisions in the coming years? Something to think about.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like food for thought for sure. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into carbon offsetting. It's complex, it's evolving, but it's definitely a conversation worth having. Until next time.